Yeah, hello everybody, macroeconomics, and we are through with the part where we are describing the economy and we have introduced all main variables, GDP growth, unemployment, interest rates, inflation, and the dependencies between these variables, real and nominal variables, and now we are switching to the general oh the general explanation of the economy. So we want to try to theoretically describe what happens in the economy, and for this we are starting, so to speak, with the so-called Keynesian economics in a very strict way. So we will do very strict assumptions, and then we will start to relax these assumptions, and so we then are moving more or less smoothly from Keynesian economics to neoclassical economics. And what is really important, that within these two views on the economy, when we are asked what to do in a crisis or in a special economic situation, within these two views, you will get very different answers. And somehow these different answers were more or less also the reason for the breakdown of our government, of our coalition in Germany, because within this coalition, we had, so to speak, these different views on the economy. What shall we do? So within one view, you can really say, well, it is quite okay to increase debt for investment in order to finance the huge tasks which we have nowadays. If we look to Ukraine, it is doubtless that we have to invest in military. If we look outside, what climate, what weather is doing, it is more or less clear that we have invest in this task. Or if we look at our infrastructure, at our bridges, railways, and so on, then of course also everybody would say we have to invest there. And if you look at your sector, education, investing in human capital, it is also doubtless that a country like Germany, where we don't have these classical resources, that we, of course, in a developed country have to invest in education. But how to finance it? And the answer for this is quite different within these two views, the Keynesian view and the neoclassical view. And before we start with the content, I want also again recommend that you participate next week on Wednesday. So we won't have the lecture at 8 o'clock, but I invite you to the talk of Christopher Zuber from the scientific staff of the Council of Economic Advisors, and he will give a talk about the annual report this council is writing every year. And of course, this is all I recommend this also because it is a general overview of the German economy and what happened within this German economy the last year. So he will also talk about economic growth, inflation, and all the things we were talking about. So it would be also quite good in the view that you will have to write a little term paper where you also have to deal, as I already said, with these aggregate numbers and where I will give you a specific country which you should describe. And so this is then more or less, again, the example for describing the economy with the example of Germany. And yeah, the talk will be in English, so no problem for you to participate. And it would be really nice if there will be also some students within the room, although the talk will also be streamed. So I would be really happy if there are not only one or two students. Yeah. Oh, this is the large lecture hall. I think 102 it's also called. It's in the main building, and it is the largest lecture hall we have, just in the middle of the main building. I think it's uh, also called 100 H102, I think. Maybe I find it here. Yes, H102. It's in the main building. Okay, and then 1 week later, we will also have the talk about monetary policy, and this, of course, is also quite good to hear for your little term paper you will later on write, write in January. So, but back again to our start of dealing with theoretical models, and yeah, this is called Keynesian economics, and John Maynard Keynes is maybe, or yeah, is one of the most famous economists in the 20th century, in the beginning of the 20th century. And yeah, what he has done is that he really started a different view on the economy, because until his analysis, we had more or less only the neoclassical view on the economy. And then in 1929, in 1930, we had this crash on the stock markets in the United States. And unfortunately, after that, we had the world economic crisis. And in the aftermath, we had in Germany, especially, the catastrophe of a dictatorship and World War II. And yeah, one reason that we had this very large economic crisis in the 1930s in the world, especially in Germany, was more or less that the answer to the crisis was that since the inflation exploded in Germany, to rise interest rates. And what does rising interest rates? It makes credits more expensive, so the economy went even more in a slowdown. in Europe. And well, after that, 3 years later, we had a dictatorship in Germany. And he recommended doing something else within the crisis, really to start investing, especially starting public investment in order to stabilize the economy. And that this can function, there one has to make that assumption that the enterprises, so to speak, the supply side, cannot adjust their prices in order to take the new demand via the public when, so to speak, the government is giving to everybody, let's say, 1,000 euros. So if you have this higher income, then an enterprise can start with two reactions. Increasing due to the higher demand, the production, or just knowing, well, the guys have now 1,000 euros more, so I can just increase my prices. And somehow we had this already when we looked to the different functions of money demand. In one case, we had this Keynesian money demand depending on interest and on income, and the other one was the neoclassical money demand derived from the from the quantity theory of money, where we just had this one-to-one mapping. Increasing money means just increasing inflation. So what we really have to keep in mind, that the production side now in our model, this doesn't mean that in practice, of course, prices are changing, but we are now dealing with a theoretical model where we have at first, before we can make the calculations, to talk about our assumptions. And now we make the assumption that prices cannot adjust. And what we also say is that in general, we have a demand side driven economy. So more or less we take demand glasses on our eyes, and we just say also we know that we have also demand and supply within our economy. And this is sometimes other people say, well, there is only demand when I'm talking about Keynesian economics. That's not true. There is also, John Maynard Keynes is also talking about equilibrium and about equating demand and supply, but he focuses mainly on the demand side. So our very strict additional assumption is also, and there you can think of your microeconomics course, you are doing your utility maximizing. You just say, well, max x1 alpha x2 1 minus alpha subject to m equals p1 x1 plus p2 x2. Well, and from this you obtain a demand function for your two goods, which just is x1d of P1 and M is alpha M over P1. So you obtain your classical demand function x1 depending on P. P1 is just a hyperbola, this falling demand curve. So, but this is your demand curve. Then we are aggregating every demand curve. So this is then more or less our consumption plan derived from utility maximization. And then we say we are moving to the market with our consumption plan. And then we assume that our consumption plan will be fully fulfilled. So that given prices, well, we can really buy that much bicycles, milk, chairs, and so on, which we have planned to buy. And also for the investment goods. So all demand plans will be fulfilled. So we will produce all these goods we want to have for a given price. So this means demand side driven economy, and that the supply side, if we change our plans, is just adjusting their production. So the supply follows demand. Well, and then of course, this is quite critical. How should it be possible that we, so to speak, if we want to consume more, that the supply side can just adjust their production so that they can directly increase their production? Then, of course, we also have to make the assumption that production capacities are not fully utilized. Remember when we have talked about the business cycle, when we are within a boom, so at full capacity or even over capacity, working longer, working more than 40 hours, working 45 hours for the last 3 months. Then additionally to adjust production, to increase production, this wouldn't be possible anymore. But if, on the other hand, we are in a situation where capacities are not fully utilized, if we have unemployment and so, then we could more or less directly increase production if the demand is shifting outward. So this is very important that you keep in mind these assumptions, and then we have to ask ourselves, in which kind of a situation is our economy? So are these assumptions okay for the description of our economy in a special situation? That in general we have situations where these assumptions make no sense is quite clear. But it could be the case that these assumptions make sense. Well, and especially this assumption here, there we always would say, well, we always see that prices are adjusting. We always have inflation. So why do we make these assumptions? Well, in general, this is then not 100% strict assumption. We more or less want to argue that prices cannot adjust very fast, so that we have in general frictions within our markets. But we are talking here in the introductory course that we just fix our prices in order to really get the argument. Where are the points where we can really understand how the argumentation within this model works? And therefore, we make the very strict assumption that prices cannot adjust. In general, if we want to apply Keynesian economics to the real economy, then we would say, well, we have a little bit to relax this assumption that we assume, well, there are situations where we have frictions within the market, and that if we out of equilibrium, then this adjusting process is not very fast. So in general, we assume that we have rigidities in the price adjusting process. And then we can ask in which markets we find these rigidities. And there we would say, well, in financial markets, at the stock market, where every day prices are set, there we have a quite fast pricing process. There, this is assumption won't be a good assumption. But if we go, for example, to the labor market, there we in general find restrictions on the price adjusting process. Because why? Think of, I don't know, somebody of you will already work and then you have signed a contract. And in this contract, maybe it lasts for one semester, for 6 months. There is written down for the next 6 months, you obtain, I don't know, for 20 hours work per week, 25 euros per hour. I don't know how much you get. But this is then fixed for the next 6 months. This can hardly be changed. Well, your enterprise could went in insolvency within this time, then you won't get any money anymore. But this is very improbable. So you see, due to the contracts you have in the labor market, and especially in Germany, there you see that in general, one could say that in the labor market, where you have wages and work, LV, that within the labor market, if you are out of equilibrium, there the price adjusting process is in general not very fast. So especially in the labor market, we have in general wage rigidities. And then we know already, take our approach where we have looked calculating GDP via the production function. We know overall income, overall production is some function depending on capital and labor. So labor, but also labor is more or less the main production factor in the economy. And since so in the market of the good, which is the main production factor in the economy, we find these rigidities, then we can also say we can motivate that it is quite okay to make in general within a model describing the overall economy that prices do not adjust. Okay, so in the end, we can say that aggregate demand is determining our equilibrium and just supply is following our demand. Well, and then we directly can use what we have already learned because we had the expenditure approach, calculating GDP, overall production in our economy. So, taking expenditure approach of calculating GDP. This was the demand view on total income. Well, and then we write it just down. What were the main parts of the expenditure approach? Private consumption, total investment, government expenditure. Well, and then we had also the trade balance. But within our description, we will abandon this one in order to obtain a simpler model. Well, of course, in the end, we are not alone in the world. And we are, especially in Germany, depending on our trade. But now we just want to focus on the function of our economy. And therefore, we just say, well, this would be just an additional number. For Germany, we had the numbers roughly plus 100 billion euros. But this fixed number of the trade balance would not really change the view of the economy. Therefore, we just leave out, in this case, the trade balance. Okay, and then we have to say, well, these three numbers here we obtain from the statistics, but then we make the main assumption that we say, so to speak, we are now, please remember it, we are now in a short run view on the economy. So, and for this assumption that we are in the short run view, we say, well, investment and government expenditure, they are the plans, how much we want to expend when we are discussing government expenditure, that these are medium-term or long-term decisions. For I and G, we assume that these are medium or long-term variables. And therefore, we just say, well, these variables are just fixed numbers. And therefore, we take I and G as fixed in the short term. Later on, especially for investment, we will relax these assumptions. But right now we say, well, investment is a medium long-term decision, and also the discussion is always for at least 1 year within the government, how large should be the public budget, and therefore it is not short-term. So therefore also we call these I and G are exogenous. Exogenous means they are just given. Exogenous, given numbers. And then how to determine total production? Well, then we make the so-called Keynesian consumption hypothesis. So we introduce the Keynesian consumption function, and the Keynesian hypothesis, Keynesian consumption hypothesis is just means that we say consumption depends positively on income. Well, and then we can ask what is the easiest way to model with the function this assumption of positive dependence? Well, and then we just say, okay, it's a linear line. So we assume that we have a fixed slope of this linear line. This is called the marginal propensity to consume. So in this case, you can think of, again, the circular flow. You have some income, and then you make your consumption saving decisions. And then, for example, you say, well, directly from my 1,000 euros, I will directly spend 800 euros. And this would then mean that your propensity to consume is 0.8. 0.8 times 1,000 is 800. And the rest you would save. But then we make an additional assumption that there is also a fixed part in the consumption function. And this we call autonomous consumption. And there, unfortunately, like it is quite often, that within the internet you find something where some people say that they explain something very easy to you, especially in economics, and that all the lectures you don't need because they can do this quite better and they can do it within 5 minutes. Well, you can look up these nice videos, but quite often, unfortunately, it is not right what is told there. And especially in this case, well, there it is said this autonomous consume would be something, well, of course, if we look just at this function, we see this number is always there, even when we have no income, because it's a fixed number. And then the explanation is, well, this has to be something like substantial consumption. Well, even if I have no income, then I still have to eat. I still need a roof at the top. This sounds very logical, but it doesn't have anything to do with Keynesian economics, with our model here. Because this is just the assumption. And for this assumption, that consumption depends on positively on income. We don't need this number here. And why have we introduced this number? To introduce this number has just the reason that we want to describe the real economy. And then we went to aggregate data, and then we found that average consume is declining with increasing income. So on a macroeconomic view, this means the richer an economy measured via GDP, the less is the part of GDP which we are consuming. This is just an empirical fact which we find. So if we go to Africa and looking there at a country, then we will see that the part of their total income the society is consuming is higher compared to the part the German society is consuming. And this is just an empirical fact, and this one we have to describe. And the easiest way to describe this is to introduce this fixed number. And how this works, I show you. So the reason for this number is the empirical fact that the higher the income, y, the lower is average consumption. And the reason is not something like substantial consumption like you find it very often in 5 minutes videos in the internet. Because then you are mixing just microeconomics and macroeconomics. And here we have this aggregate view. And so, please, it is quite hard to distinguish within the internet what is a qualitatively good explanation and what is not. And while you are sitting here, because I think you right now don't know it. And this is, in general, the problem with the information in the internet. So I really recommend not only looking at Facebook and at Twitter and elsewhere, but please also read at least the online versions of newspapers. There, in general, you can more or less rely on what is written down there. And also, with all these, especially short-term explanations, well, microeconomics in 10 minutes. This doesn't work, sorry. Because here we have to deal with complex content. And complex content cannot, by definition, be explained in a simple way. If you explain it in a simple way, then you are leaving out things. Because then if you read in the comments part below these nice little videos, well, I have heard a lecture over one semester and I have understood nothing. I'm so thankful that you have explained it to me within 5 minutes. I'm sorry, it is quite often wrong, or quite often it is too simple. What is that, sir? So, but why is it the case that we can find this empirical fact that with larger income, average income is decreasing? For this, we just write average consumption. So average consumption is just C over total income. We divide it by our total income. And if we write this down, we find C0 over Y plus CY, fixed number, marginal propensity to consume, times Y over Y. These two cancels. And then if we say now increase Y, then only this part is left. And this part is, of course, going down if Y is increasing. Or what you also can do is, if we call this average consumption, depending on Y, then you can calculate the first derivative of average consumption. And this is just C prime times Y minus C times 1 over Y squared. C prime is just by definition our marginal propensity to consume. So here we obtain Cy times Y minus C0 minus Cy times Y over Y squared. These two cancels. So this is smaller than 0, and this means average consumption is decreasing with increasing Y. So, okay. This is just one of the parts. Also, if you look at other videos, you sometimes find things which are not right. Okay, but back again, because now we are more or less done with our model. Because now we can write down total demand. And for in total demand, we introduce our Keynesian consumption function. And then we go back to our assumption that we say, okay, the supply side follows the demand side. So this is our demand plan. And now we say supply is following. So Y we can also interpret as production. Remember the different views we had in the beginning of the lecture. And now we say here is the expenditure approach. And now we say production is following, just equaling our demand plan. So this part here is then supply follows demand. This is our equilibrium condition. And let's do this in green. And keep in mind, until now, we do not find prices within our model. So there is no P. Well, we could introduce P. Remember how we defined GDP? Market value of all goods and services and so on. Market value. So we could introduce just in front of our YD everywhere the prices, but since we have assumed that prices are fixed, we can, so to speak, set every price to 1 because it doesn't change. And therefore, in our model, it would just cancel out. And therefore, we don't need it due to our assumption. So, and now we want to see how our model is working. In general, we have this decision between consumption and saving. So if we look up empirical numbers for Germany, we find that we save around 10, a little bit more, 11%. Within Corona, it went up to 16, 17%. Because why in Corona? Well, it was just forbidden to consume. And then from this, we can more or less estimate what would be our marginal propensity to consume. This is the other part, what we are not saving, we are consuming. So in general, we could say in Germany, this marginal propensity to consume would be roughly 90%, or in this case, 89%. So the interpretation of this is then, if we have additional 1,000 euros, then directly we would take 890 euros and going downward to Wilhelmshaven in some shop and buying trousers, pullovers, and anything else. And now we go to the graphical interpretation. So as I have already said, we are modeling consumption in the more or less easiest way in order to describe this Keynesian hypothesis. So we say this is just a linear line. The fixed number is the cut at the vertical axis, autonomous consumption, and the slope is our CY, the marginal propensity to consume. And for this CY, of course, also, this I think I have forgotten, but I have written down it here. Yeah. that this has to be smaller than 1. What does this mean? If we have additional 1,000 euros, we cannot spend 1,100 euros because we only have 1,000 euros. And therefore, of course, this has also to be smaller than 1. This is also an assumption. So in general, if we want to draw this, it is just a linear line cutting at the autonomous consumption and a slope lower than 1. So, and now we put this together in the overall demand. We had overall demand is C0 plus Cy times Y plus I times G. And now let's also make an easy example. Let's say C0 is 50, I 150, and G should be 200, and Cy should be 0.8. If I now want to draw total expenditure, YD, how do I have to draw it in my diagram? Who can help me? Well, let's put in all the numbers. 50 plus 0.8 y times 150 times 100. So yd is just a function of y. What do I have to do if I want to draw this function? Idea? No. Well, for this, of course, we can also just use the internet. This I also would recommend if you want to make some more complicated calculations. This is the front end of Mathematica. And then what do we have? We have 50 plus 0.8 times x plus 150 plus 100. So I haven't said what he should do, but he just thinks of what he could do. And here you see just the drawing of the linear line. Today, you just can put it in and you get. But I recommend that you know what you are doing, and therefore you should also be able to do it by your own. So I sum up all these parts here together is 300 plus 0.8 y. So what I would then find is that this is the cut of the vertical axis. Let's say here 300 C0 plus I plus G. Three hundred, 600, 900, 600, 900. And well, then we know here is 900, 900. We know that the slope is lower than 1. So our linear line has to be a little bit flatter than 1. By hand, let's say it is this one here. So this is yd equals c0 plus I plus g plus cy times y, in our special case 300 plus 0.8 times y. Well, and then now our model, we have the equilibrium condition. Yd equals y. How can we draw this equilibrium condition within our model? You see here on the vertical axis, we have, oh, here we have to have also income, sorry. And on the horizontal axis, income. What kind of function is just this here? Oh, there is it. Oh, G200. Oh, sorry. Yes. If we have 200, you are right. So we need to have here 400. 400. Thank you very much. And 400. You are totally right. And this has to be at 200. But what kind of function is this when we write down on the vertical axis yd and on the horizontal y? What kind of function is this? How do you draw f of x is x? Well, maybe this is the easiest function we have. F of x we can also write as 0 plus 1 times x. So cut off the vertical axis at the origin and slope is 1. So this then would go through 400, 400, 600, 600, 900, 900, and hopefully I get through it almost. Yd equals y. When always on the vertical and horizontal axis we have the same values. Linear line through the origin with slope 1. And if we have the same units on the horizontal and vertical axis, then this would be just a linear line with an angle of 45 degrees. And therefore, this is also called the 45-degree line, if you look it up in some textbooks. But what does this mean? Yd equals y. So on this line, we find all possible equilibria where we have demand equals supply. On every point on this 45-degree line, we meet the assumption yd equals y. But then we know yd is explicitly given as c0 plus I plus g plus cy times y. And therefore, the overall equilibrium is just the cut of yd and the 45-degree line. So this is equilibrium of our economy. Here I have it, in a maybe a little bit better way described, but now we have also discussed within this model, as you hopefully have done it also in the market diagram, supply and demand, and there you have discussed what happens if you are out of equilibrium, that you have there forces driving you into the equilibrium. Hopefully you have discussed this, that we have a stable equilibrium in the market diagram here. And now we have to discuss this also for our model, where also supply and demand is meeting. So what happens if we start here in a situation where we are out of equilibrium, lower than equilibrium income? This would mean that in this case, demand is larger than production. And now we say, okay, supply in such a situation is following the demand. So we have to increase production. This means the inventory has to decrease. So we are pushing production to this level. But on both axes, we have the same units. And this means if we then have increased our production to Y1 due to this higher demand, what again we find? We again find there is still something left. There's still demand higher than production. So again, we have an adjusting process. But always due to our assumptions, since production is following demand, we are driving into equilibrium. And then we can ask, well, if we are in a situation where we have a larger income than equilibrium income, their production is too large. So our consumption plans say, well, you have produced 10 bicycles, but I will buy only 8. What happens then? Well, 2 of the bicycles has to be kept away, so we build up inventory. And then we see, okay, having reduced our production to this level, it is still too large. Still, demand is higher than production. So we even have to reduce more production. And also, this process is then us driving into the equilibrium. Well, And so now we are more or less in this Keynesian economics, looking just at the commodity market at the end. We have described our overall equilibrium and we have argued that this is stable. And what we then will do in on Thursday is now doing economic policy. If this is the full description of our economy, what can we do to improve, for example, economic growth? And this we will do then on Thursday. Thank you very much for today.